Thank you for watching our discussion of the extraordinarily important event of the San Remo Conference 100 years ago. It's a great time to talk about that because now, this year, a full century after the international community met in Paris and San Remo to establish a post-imperial world order founded on independent nation states, only now has the international community, under the leadership of Donald Trump, begun to fully implement the understandings and promises made by them at San Remo. At San Remo, the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine and an explicit right to, quote, settle throughout the territory, which included, of course, Judea and Samaria. The international community, however, did nothing to implement its promise or ensure its fulfillment in the face of reluctance by the mandatory government and growing anti-immigrant xenophobia from local Arabs. In practice, it was left entirely up to the Jews to implement as much of this promise as they could by establishing the State of Israel in 1948. However, much of the territory intended for this state was occupied by Jordan and Egypt and ethnically cleansed. After Israel retook these territories in 1967, much of the international community pretended its earlier guarantees did not exist. Far from allowing Jewish settlement throughout the territory, as San Remo promised, they claimed that settlement was illegal, was an international crime, and that the areas Jordan ethnically cleansed of Jews in 1948 must forever remain Jew-free zones, with Israel enforcing the restriction on Jewish migration. But now, 100 years after the Paris Conference, a leader emerged who was prepared to actualize the commitments the League of Nations had made. President Trump's recognition of a united Jerusalem and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's conclusion that Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal represent a proper understanding of the League of Nations mandate. More importantly, they are perhaps the first leaders who refuse to subordinate Israel's legal rights to political blackmail from Arab states. The post-World War I arrangements, begun in Paris in 1919 and culminating in San Remo 100 years ago, gave rise to the states of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, as well as the borders of all of their neighbors. So San Remo didn't just set the legal basis for Israel, it set the borders and the national bases for all the states of the Middle East, none of which existed before. So while it's easy to criticize the artificiality of the borders made at San Remo, made by the League of Nations, in practice, in this region, ethnic and religious groups who live intermixed and not separated into grid-like boxes, some arbitrariness of borders is inevitable. Every League of Nations mandate territory, Syria, Lebanon, lumped an unhappy minority in with a larger majority. The Muslims were lumped in with Lebanon's Christians, Kurds were lumped in with Iraq's Arabs, everyone was lumped in with everyone in Syria. The process wasn't perfect, but the known alternatives are what existed before, a vast pan-ethnic empire, or every group trying to carve out its own sliver and sub-sliver of territory, which ends up looking like Syria over the past 8 years. That is why the border arrangements and the identity of states created out of the League of Nations mandate process is still universally considered valid and binding. That is why, even though Kurdish independence has a strong moral appeal, in fact, it has no legal basis and is not recognized by any country in the world because it was not separate from the borders of mandatory Mesopotamia, which became Iraq. There's only one place in the Middle East where the international community takes the entirely different position about the validity of mandatory borders. And that, of course, is Israel. While Secretary of Pompeo's statement didn't say anything specifically about borders, it did reclaim the San Remo principle that Jewish settlement is not illegal. And the legal basis for this deserves some discussion. Pompeo was responding to and repudiating the conclusions of a 1978 memorandum by the State Department legal advisor, Herbert Hansel. That memo's conclusions had already been rejected by President Reagan but it had never been formally retracted by the State Department. The 4-page memo, which concluded that Israel's presence in the West Bank, civilian presence, was illegal, moved in very broad strokes, cited no precedent for its major conclusions, and indeed, in the decades since, its legal analysis of occupation and settlements has consistently not been applied by the US or other nations to any other comparable geopolitical facts. It was always what lawyers call a one-ride ticket, applicable just to Israel. Hansel's memo had 2 major analytical steps. First, he concluded that Israel was an occupying power in the West Bank. That triggers the application of the 4th Geneva Convention. He then invoked a very obscure provision of the 4th Geneva Convention, which had never been applied in any other conflict previously and since, which says that an occupying power shall not deport or transfer its civilian population into the territory that it occupies. Hansel, without much analysis, concluded that Jews who move just over the Green Line have somehow been deported or transferred there by the State of Israel. In short, he read a prohibition on the kind of large-scale population transfers, moving millions of people in over a year, that Erdogan is contemplating in northern Syria, a policy which, by the way, the United Nations has said warrants study and consideration, conflating those kind of forced mass migration policies with a complete ban on any Jews moving into the old city of Jerusalem individually, voluntarily. In doing so, he made several basic mistakes of law. Article 49.6 of the Geneva Convention is only relevant if there's a military occupation. It only applies in situations of occupation. And occupation in international law means when one country comes and during a war takes control of the territory of another country. For example, if one country comes and liberates its own territory or that of an ally, it is not an occupying power. So if, for example, Ukraine, in some kind of miraculous war 14 years from now, would manage to take back Crimea from the Soviet Union, no one would say that Ukraine is occupying Crimea, even though most of the people there are Russian, they speak Russian, and they've been administered by Russia for the past 19 years and many, many hundreds of the past several hundred years. So you have to, occupation is when you take territory of a foreign country. So that's one important international principle. So to understand whether an occupation began in 1967, you have to consider, was the West Bank, for example, Judea and Samaria, was it territory of Jordan? Was it territory of Jordan? Or was it maybe no man's land, disputed territory, or was it territory to which Israel had a sovereign claim? And here's where San Remo becomes very relevant. San Remo established mandatory Palestine, the legal basis for the mandates. Israel is the country that emerged from the mandate for Palestine, the only country to declare independence in the wake of the mandate. There is a universal principle of international law that when a new country is created, it acquires the borders of the previous administrative unit. So the Soviet Union is composed of 16 top-level administrative units called Soviet Socialist Republics. When the Soviet Union collapses and Ukraine, Latvia, Russia become new countries, their borders are the borders of the Soviet Socialist Republic, even if those borders were drawn arbitrarily, unfairly, and without sensitivity to ethnic considerations, which was all of the time. This is true also with League of Nations mandates in the Middle East. This is why when Lebanon was partitioned from the mandate of Syria, it became a separate mandate in a separate country. And that is why the world does not accept Syria's claims to Lebanon. So what are the borders of Israel in 1948? The borders are the borders of the last top-level administrative unit, mandatory Palestine. And when Jordan invaded and occupied the West Bank, it was occupying Israeli territory. When Israel retook this territory in 1967, it was not occupying foreign territory, it was retaking its own territory that had been occupied for 19 years. That is not an occupation. That's an end of occupation. And thus, we don't even have to consider the meaning of Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention about deportation or transfer. Shockingly, the Hansel memo made absolutely no reference to this principle about determining the borders of new countries, even though it is the textbook method, it is the single and dominant method for establishing borders of new countries. He made no mention of it. But ironically, even Herbert Hansel and even the view for which this memo is often cited, that Israel is an occupying power, even in the view of the Carter era State Department memo, Israel is not an occupying power. Even in the view of the memo that said Israel was an occupying power in 1978, Israel is not now an occupying power, because occupation under international law depends entirely on the existence of a state of war. And in this very memo that Secretary Pompeo repudiated, Herbert Hansel said, of course, occupation is a technical thing. It arises from the state of war between Israel and Jordan. If Israel and Jordan were to ever make peace, which of course then seemed unrealistic in the late 70s, then there would be no occupation and no question about the legality of settlements. So even though many people like to cite this memo as evidence that some international lawyers think Israeli settlements are illegal, even if you take it at its face value today, those settlements would not be illegal. But the bottom line is that the recognition of the legality of these communities is the first step towards restoring the promise of San Remo that Jews have a full right to settle throughout the territory of mandatory Palestine.